Morning all. Once again we'll move to the unit 2 only on definition. So this is of session 23rd of the subject indirect taxes 1. Today we'll discuss on the terms like input service distributor, input tax and input tax credit. The objective of this is to gain knowledge on these terms and also to know the concept for the GST liability. Outcome is it helps the students to know the clear meaning of the ISD, that is input service distributor, input tax and also of the input tax credit, and it helps to gain knowledge for the determination of the GST liability. Here the input tax. Before that we'll know about the term input. The term input means any goods other than the capital goods used or intended to be used by the supplier in the course or for the furtherance of your business. And the tax paid on the inward supply of inputs and any capital and services are called as the input taxes. Means the input means any goods other than the capital goods that are used or intended to be used by the supplier in the course or for the furtherance of any business is known as the input. Here input tax, it is the tax paid by the registered person. The tax may be central tax or state tax or any integrated tax, means CGST, SGST or any IGST or UTGST, that is levied on the input or on the inward supply or any of supply of goods or services made on any forward charge basis or any reverse charge basis or on the import of the goods. Next is the term input service. It is defined under section 2 subsection 53. Input service means here any service used, same thing, any service used or intended to be used by a supplier in the course of the business or for the furtherance of business. It's known as the input service. Input service means any service used or intended to be used by a supplier in the course of or for the furtherance of the business is known as the input service. Input service distributor is here. Input service distributor means it is shortly we call it as a ISD, is a businessman which receives invoices for services used by its branches. Here it is the distributes the tax paid to such branches on a proportional basis by assuming an ISD invoice. The branches can have different GST but must have the same PAN as that of the ISD. And again, the input service provider we also means that it is an office of the supplier of goods and services which receives tax invoices for towards the receipt of input services. It issues a prescribed document for the purpose of distributing the credit of any taxes, GST, that is CGST, SGST, IGST, that's paid on the above said services. For the taxable person, the taxable person for taxable supply of goods and services having the same PAN, I told, having the same PAN as that of the ISD. And what are the provisions of the ISD, other provisions with respect to the ISD? So here before that we can make a note of one example with respect to the ISD, that is input service distributor. Here the example we can take that the head office of like ABC Limited is located at Bangalore. They are having a branches at Chennai, Mumbai or any Delhi. The head office incurs some annual software maintenance expenses or any services received on behalf of all its branches and received the invoice for the same. Since actually the software is used by all branches, the input tax credit for entire services cannot be claimed at one place, that's at Bangalore. the same has to be distributed to all the three locations. Three locations means here the Chennai, Mumbai and I told Delhi. Here the head office at Bangalore is the input service distributor to all other its branches. So this is one small example with respect to ISD, input service distributor. Let us see what are the other provisions for the ISD. Other provisions means first is that ISD cannot distribute the input tax credit, means that paid on the inputs, that is example raw materials, capital goods, any for any machines purchased, etc. Second thing is that it is to outsource the manufacturers or service providers. Second provision is that here the IST under earlier regime and GST regime. What is the IST status under the earlier regime and under the GST regime? Here, in case of earlier regime, uh, it's so many points we can take. There's point of difference. Uh, who who can be input service distributor? Under earlier regime, an office of the manufacturer or producer of the final products or provider of output service is treated as the IST. Under GST regime, an office of the supplier of goods or services. Second thing is that documents based on which credit can be distributed. In case of earlier regime, here any invoices issued under section 4A of service tax rules of 1994 towards purchase of input services. But under GST regime, tax invoices issued by supplier towards receipt of input services. Next is about the how to distribute credit. How to distribute credit? Under earlier regime, the credit is distributed by issuing invoice, bill or challan for the purpose of distributing such manufacturer or producer or provider. But in case of GST regime, the credit is distributed by issuing an IST invoice for the purpose of distributing to a supplier of taxable goods or services having the same PAN as that of the office referred to above. And here next is on the to whom it is to be distributed. So under earlier regime, to its units and to outsourced manufacturers, but under GST regime to suppliers having the same PAN, that is credit cannot be distributed to outsourced manufacturer or any service providers. Thus, on looking into the highlights of any differences under the between the two regimes, distribution of credit is restricted to office having the same PAN. Next provision is that conditions to be fulfilled by the ISC, ISD, that is condition is registration and invoicing. Registration means input service distributor has to compulsorily register as ISD apart from its registration as a normal taxpayer under the Act. Second conditions to be fulfilled by ISD is that invoicing. ISD can distribute the amount of tax credit to recipients as earlier stated by issuing an ISD invoice only. Third condition is that returns. Amount of tax credit distributed should not exceed the amount of tax credit available with the IST as at the end of a relevant month, that is to be filed in GSTR 6 by 13th of the succeeding month of IST. And next, the IST need not file annual returns. Next provision is the distribution of input tax credit. The credit of input tax paid under reverse charge mechanism is not available for distribution to the recipients. So here the IST has to utilize such credits only as a normal taxpayer. Next is input tax credit. Here input tax credit, it is one of the fundamental features of GST for the seamless flow of input credit across the chain and across the country. In simple meaning, ITC. ITC means input tax credit, means the credit of input taxes, whatever we pay at the time of inward supply of goods and services. Secondly, the input tax credit means at the time of paying tax on output, you can reduce the tax liability which is already paid on the inputs or on the inward supply and pay the balance amount. And the conditions. What are the conditions to claim the input tax credit? Uh, Here ITC input tax credit can be claimed by a person registered under GST only if he fulfills the conditions prescribed. The first is that the dealer should be in possession of tax invoice. Secondly, the said goods and services has to be received. Thirdly, the returns have to be filed. And fourthly, the tax charged has been paid to the government by the supplier. Next, when goods are received in installment, ITC can be claimed only when the last lot is received. Lastly, no ITC will be allowed if depreciation has been claimed on tax components of a capital goods. So these are the some conditions that's has to be fulfilled to claim a input tax credit. Some of the goods and services which are not eligible for input tax credit. Uh, the sum of the goods means the goods like motor vehicles, foods, outdoor caterings, beauty, treatment, health, uh, service, cosmetics, plastic surgery, membership of a club, etc. So these are some goods where the input tax credit cannot be claimed. So this is about the terms that is of input tax, ITC input tax credit, and about the ISD input service distributor.